I think everyone's here knowing that this is a very tense time. You and I have spoken on platforms several times before, not just at the Singapore summit, that these are uneasy times for everyone, leadership particularly. But let me ask you for your perspectives, particularly about the stresses that are appearing, whether in the corporate leadership field or the political leadership field. And let me start by quoting you what's happening in Bratislava in Slovakia, the EU presidency at the moment. Donald Tusk, the president of the council. The EU is shaken, quote, shaken by all kinds of crises recently and cannot act as if nothing is wrong. We must not let this crisis go to waste. We've heard that kind of phrase before. But he's appealing for leaders to take a sober and honest look at the problems. How sober and honest do you think people are, both in government and the corporate field, about the scale of challenges, whether it be growth or so many other issues at the moment?
Well, I think the mood of despondency is there, and you see it in politics, you see it in society. People are sober, but I don't think we are close to the solutions and the actions required to get out of this funk. Pessimism isn't a bad thing if it spurs us into hard thinking, honest appraisal about where the problems are, and some conjoining of forces at the center, in the middle of the political spectrum, so that we decide, look, we've got to move and we've got to do something real. But so far we haven't seen enough of that translation of pessimism into action. Part of the reason is that the problems are complex, particularly in the advanced world. They are economic, they are social, they are to some extent challenges in multi-ethnic societies, and they are geopolitical. And when you have a confluence of problems of that nature, it requires extra courage, leadership that sort of sets aside party postures and ideological postures and thinks long term. And if we are lucky, coming out of the present problems, we will get that leadership and that strengthening in the center. If we are not lucky, we'll get more of the same.
Do you think there's a danger of an assumption that luck will be on everyone's side?
I don't think anyone's assuming that. I think there's just a mood of helplessness right now.
Helplessness. You've already used the word funk, despondency, helplessness. Is there anything to
not as a permanent state of affairs?
At least they've only just had soup. But seriously, you're using some very tough language there. What can you see in terms of reaction to this among the leaderships, people like yourselves, and in the corporate world, in every single kind of government as well, whether it be in the developed world, we've just seen the G20 in China, we're seeing it in the emerging markets, and we're seeing it in the developing world as well, a real sense, particularly because of the oil price, of it ain't like it used to be.
So first, I think the global story is dominated too much by the problems of the advanced world, and they're real problems. But if you have to look at the world as a whole, look at Asia, look at Africa, look at Latin America, and there are problems everywhere. It's a picture where trade is in fact growing, contrary to some of the stories. The commodity price boom is over, that's true. China's stimulus during the crisis is over, so you don't get over-investment and you don't suck in commodities the way you used to, that's true. But trade is still growing. It's still growing faster than economic growth. Globalization is still overwhelmingly a positive thing for most of the world. Certainly for Asia, there's still huge opportunity left in integrating first with each other and integrating with the rest of the world. So we can't get too taken or too carried away by the storyline that comes out of the problems in the West. That's the first point I'll make. The second point I'll make is that the storyline in the West, I didn't mean to suggest that pessimism is a permanent state of affairs. It's just that it has to lead to a coalescing around the center and actions that will really get us out of the present problems. And it's not as if there are no solutions. It's not as if there are no solutions. It's not as if there are no ways in which we can help those who lose out because of trade and technology.
But do you think the solutions have been identified? Easy to say problem means there must
I would say they've been identified in rarefied circles, think tanks, universities, commentators, but they do not feature very much in political debate.
Why do you think that is?
I think we're just moving towards a more short-term political culture. And in a sense, there's a vicious circle. Problems grow, society is getting more polarized, and politicians, rather than rise above the polarization, get more populist and short-term. It's not a given state of affairs, but like I say, it requires courage. Maybe we need a deeper crisis.
Even deeper than now?
Quite possibly. Quite possibly. It's not as if, if you go to Europe or if you go to France or Japan, frankly, if you go to France or Japan, you don't sense a crisis in society or economy. And it is not difficult for politics, whether on the left or the right, to talk about ethnic issues, to talk about immigration, to talk about China, to talk about threats outside, and not focus on the central issues of domestic policy responses for a new world.
Let me see, does anyone want to come in? I haven't got any messages yet, but would anyone like to come in, or do send me messages? We're already 10 minutes into the discussion, and I'm more than happy to open it up to anyone who wants to come in. But here in Singapore, for those who don't know Singapore very well, what happened in your election in 2011 was a shock to you. But you and the PM have talked very openly about the impact that had. And you could use some of the words you've used already today as a reflection of what happened 5 years ago in your country. What have you learned here in Singapore about how to respond? Because the PM, I think, at an earlier Singapore summit said this is now a 24/7 business. We're on the record. We're here to be accountable as political leaders now.
Well, I think the main advantage we have in Singapore is we don't give ourselves too much luxury of time. We know we have to move. We know we don't have many choices. So when we have an economic challenge, when we have a challenge of terrorism, whichever challenge, it has to be addressed forthrightly, openly, and we have to find a way of moving. It's partly because we are a small country. We've always been vulnerable, and it creates a political psyche. It creates a political psyche which is very different from complacency. It helps to have few choices in life. It helps to have few choices, but to move ahead, address problems, and when you're not succeeding, try and find a better way of doing it.
I've got a question here from Vincent from BCG. You've once said that Singapore believes in providing a trampoline rather than a safety net. And indeed, that's what you've done to an extent. As this is a global conference, is this a lesson others can emulate? How easy is it for countries to get people to bounce up? It's a great question.
So it's a nice phrase, but it's actually about a combination of social and economic policies. We can't assume that people can fend for themselves in the marketplace and somehow or other everyone rises up. There is a role for the state, there's a role for community action, there's a role to help people in difficulty. But the real question is how you do it. Do you do it by keeping people on the dole? Do you do it with all the sympathy that you have by keeping them out of the labor market? Or do you do it by rewarding personal responsibility, rewarding an effort to get into a job, and helping them to improve on the job? So there is a very important space in public policy that's both social and economic policy that's about state activism to support personal effort and responsibility at work, in the way we raise our families, the way we go through education. Anyone who's putting in effort, it doesn't matter how low they're starting from, if you're putting in the effort, they deserve some support. And there is that very important space. You can't describe it as being either left or right or conservative or liberal, but there's a very important space of combining an activist state, not leaving things to the market, but incentivizing everyone to put in the effort and responsibility. And if you do it well, after a while it becomes a culture. It becomes a social culture.
You've created here a state of just under 6 million people where you encourage a significant amount of business to come here. You and I shared the platform once at a commodity discussion, and the way that is being developed here in Singapore. Can I ask you how much you can share about, given the kind of language you've used in the first 15 minutes, DPM, about, if you like, the unthinkables that could be coming down the track, and what you therefore have to think about as a leader, as a political leader, of what might have to be embraced and confronted as opposed to just accepted?
Well, first, we should think of disruptive changes. We should never think of progress as linear, whether it's in Asia or globally, and we should expect shocks from time to time. The geopolitics is obvious enough. Terrorism is now a fact of life. It's here with us in Southeast Asia, and it is global, and it'll be here for a long time to come. The economics itself is, I think, one which now allows for a lot more discontinuity than used to be thought, whether it's in China or emerging markets as a whole. There's a wider range of possibilities that could emerge. But I think the way we have to think about it in politics and in policy making is how we can be as resilient as possible when the unthinkable happens, how we can be robust to a range of outcomes. That's the way we have to think about it. We don't sit and wait to see what happens and feel we're unlucky when something bad happens. We've got to just prepare ourselves to be resilient. And it means being resilient in the nature of our society, so that if you get a terrorist incident, you don't get a divided society, you don't get people who are suspicious of each other, but you get a coalescing. And in our case, it's a coalescing around what it means to be Singaporean. And if you don't prepare ourselves in advance for that possibility, you're more likely to see division. So what we do now shapes what happens when the unthinkable happens. We are not powerless. We are not powerless. Likewise, technology. We know that it's potentially disruptive. We know that it could lead to significant job losses anywhere in the world. But what we do now to equip people with the skills required to be able to work in technology-augmented jobs, technology-enriched jobs, will determine whether or not you get that hollowing out in the workforce, or whether you're able to get a society where productivity goes up and wages go up, and everyone feels that technology is their friend, not their enemy.
Does anyone want to come in? We've got half an hour to run. Anyone want to intervene in the conversation? I can't see any hands. Yes, please. Could I get? It's Peter Mandelson. Yes, Peter. I was going to ask about obviously the messages on Brexit and globalization, but is that something you want to pursue, Peter Mandelson?
No.
Okay. You've got a better question.
I don't want to talk about Brexit directly, funnily enough. But I do want to ask a related question. And that is that for years, people have been arguing in this part of Asia, including in Singapore, that people would benefit from the breaking down of national barriers and the creation across ASEAN of a strong regional economic bloc where barriers were reduced and trade and investment could flow more freely. But that has travelled at a snail's pace. And the question is, given the recent experience in Europe, do you think this will be a discouragement to those who are travelling at a snail's pace and slow them down even further in ASEAN?
Thank you.
So I think that's a very good question. First, we can't take the wrong lessons from Europe. Asia doesn't have a common currency. ASEAN doesn't have a common currency. We are integrating in a more bottom-up, real economy-driven fashion. I think we're not doing badly on goods, on the integration of the whole business of product markets. We're not doing badly on investments, and you only have to look at the way investments are flowing in and out of ASEAN, within ASEAN. Business is being done, deals are being struck. It's quite a thriving scene. I think we are slow on services, and that's something where we really need to get a lot more serious, whether it's financial services or a whole range of modern services. It's also a huge opportunity because services are the fastest area of growth in the Asian economy, whether it's China or India or Southeast Asia, in the next 15 or 20 years. But it does mean that we'll all do better if we open our markets, develop strengths in the things we are good at, and the same gains we got from trade in goods can be obtained in trade in services. So it's not an unmitigated picture of slow progress on integration at all. I think ASEAN has actually done quite well in its own bottom-up fashion, one building block at a time, to integrate goods markets and investment, to create an investment market that's effectively a common ASEAN market, and we need to be a lot faster on services.
Anyone else want to come in at the stage? Yes, please, microphone there. Anyone else? So I can get a microphone to you. Could we get a microphone here, please, quickly? I tell you what, while the microphone's going there, DPM, can I just ask you, because even though if Peter didn't want to talk about Brexit, and we don't want to talk about Brexit as such, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow, but there are messages which are being debated at this very moment in Bratislava by the 27, not the 28. And obviously that's a long way from here, but there are some very significant issues here about globalization and the concerns about globalization, and whether actually globalization has now lost touch with large numbers who it was believed would benefit enormously. Now, here in Singapore, you've done fantastically well out of globalization. Right. But the alienation which has been created for a whole bundle of reasons, as we saw in Britain, and we are about to see probably in several other European nations, and probably in the United States in some form or another. What is your view as to whether this is really a profound change underway?
So I think this, for the last 30 or 40 years, we've all grappled with competition. And competition is now much more present because of the fact that China and a whole range of emerging countries, including the former Soviet Union, the former Soviet bloc, are now part of the global market. I think the story that globalization is behind what happened in Brexit or what's happening in domestic polarization in a range of countries is vastly overstated. Our fundamental problem is that of domestic policy. People who've lost out because of technological change or trade have been left as losers for a long period of time. Look at the south of Wales, look at Tennessee, even parts of the Ruhr Valley. Depressed regions have remained depressed for a remarkable period of time. So people who've lost out haven't been helped to get back into the game. That's a domestic policy issue. You can't blame it on trade. You can't blame it on trade. So I think we have moved from a situation where the job of politics was to enable people to win and enable losers to get back in the game so the pie keeps growing, towards one of playing to the divisions.
But do you fear that
we've got to find a way of reversing that? We've got to find a way of reversing that so that politics is about looking forward, building a coalition of forces around the middle, and minimizing divisions.
But do you think there's a very serious, maybe understated or understood, not adequately understood, alienation which is going on?
There is.
Which, even though you say it's overstated,
there is, and it's
fundamental.
It is something that the narrative about globalization being responsible for this plays to. But any hard-headed analysis shows that it's not globalization that's responsible for this. In fact, most of the job losses are due to technology and productivity enhancements, and the failure of domestic policy to be able to help people to get back into the labor market. And it's not something where solutions don't exist. The solutions that involve helping people to get back, match them with an employer, provide them the training. There's a very large number of jobs in the advanced world today. Even in the US, which is the most healthy of the advanced economies, there's a very large number of jobs which are not being taken. A very large number of jobs, skilled middle-class jobs, which are not being taken. Why are they not being taken? Why are our educational institutions and our training institutions, and why are the policy incentives not allowing supply and demand to be matched? So that's a domestic policy issue. Don't blame it on trade.
And this is something which politicians have really got to address very quickly, you're saying?
Left and right.
Yeah, okay. Let me pick up. Can you just hang on one moment? Who's got the microphone? But Omar from Abaraj Capital, adding to Peter's question, will the ASEAN integration agenda be further derailed by the nationalist sentiment we're seeing being manifested in the US elections and Brexit? In other words, are you seeing pause for thought in ASEAN thinking?
I think there's anxiety over what's going to happen in the United States and its commitment to continued integration with East Asia. There's anxiety as to whether TPP will be ratified. But I don't think that connects very directly to ASEAN's own efforts to integrate. ASEAN is still moving along in the integration journey, as I mentioned earlier. And there's still a lot more that we can do within Asia to integrate those three poles, ASEAN, India, and China. Particularly, I would say, the integration with India, because ASEAN and China are already part of an Asian supply chain. The composition will change, it'll be increasingly oriented towards consumption goods and services, but there's a fairly healthy degree of integration. But India's integration with China, India's integration with Southeast Asia, still has huge potential because it's starting at a very low level.
You're using the word integration rather than what the European Union is wrestling with, the business of union. And we've seen from Juncker a few days ago in his State of the Union saying there's got to be more union. You're talking about integration.
Well, the big difference is that we didn't do this top down. We didn't start off with a political union and we didn't start off with a common currency. We started off with the building blocks of trade and investment, and we start pushing ourselves along that journey. Not as fast as everyone would like, not as fast as we would like in Singapore, but it's fairly resilient and it's not at risk of a breakdown. It's not at risk of a breakdown.
Thank you. Who's got the microphone there, please?
DPM, can I ask you to help us understand what is happening, pessimism, slow growth around the world? When you have low interest rate, even negative interest rate, plenty of liquidity, plenty of labor, and plenty of opportunities. There are a lot of areas, as you also mentioned. In developed countries, there are undeveloped areas. In developing countries and underdeveloped areas. So there is demand, the low commodity price, all-time low oil price. Then why is the world economy in this state and with all the funk and depression?
Are you sure of the answer?
So first, again, I have to repeat. I don't think the world economy is in a funk. I think our narrative talks ourselves into a funk. The world economy looks very different when you're sitting in Asia compared to some other parts of the world. There's growth, there's business being done, there are jobs being created, and incomes are going up. The emphasis in the advanced countries on monetary policy and very low interest rates has run its full course, and it's no longer having positive effects on the real economy. The emphasis on structural reforms, deregulation in some areas, activist policies to help people to participate in labor markets and to rise up a ladder of skills, that's been underdone. So there's been an overemphasis on monetary policy as some sort of solution to all our problems, and an underemphasis on policies and collective action to boost the real economy. That's the nature of our problem. But again, it's not as if the solutions don't exist. We just have to refocus away from central banks towards the tasks of governments, including governments at a city and state level and not just a federal level. But I don't think the world is in a pessimistic state. If you sit in Asia, there's growth, there's opportunity. We've got to move faster on integration in some respects, but there's lots of opportunity ahead of us.
But what you've got is that word perception. You may not feel it here in Singapore, but that is not the perception in many countries. And that's certainly what you're seeing in Europe and probably in the United States at the moment. That there's a perception that things are actually not good, even if the numbers are different.
Yes, I agree with that. So there is that perception, and that perception has to be reshaped. It has to be reshaped through political leadership at every level. Federal, state, mayors, everyone has to reshape those perceptions and get down to action.
Do you believe that can be done? It
It's-
almost seems to be fashionable
It's
to
not
be
something that
negative
it's
about
not something that is achieved by a lecture. It's achieved when you have a domestic constituency that says that, look, things are not going to improve on our current path, and we've got to find a way of changing. So it's really about politicians and their constituencies. It's domestic. It's domestic.
Anyone else like to come in, please? What about the, did I see a hand go up? The issue, you've already hinted at it, but let's talk more about jobs and work and technology and the expectation. Look at what's happening in India, 12 million new people coming onto the market every year. In this region as well, you've got robotization going on at a significant rate inside China now, which in its own way can create a challenge to the leadership there. And we're seeing it probably, that's at the heart of some of the things that were happening in Brexit, people being replaced by machines. They take investment, but actually they save money and are more efficient in the medium to long term. How do you see that playing out? You and I have talked about this once or twice before, but is it is it happening at a rate which is manageable, or is it actually the kind of investments being made by a lot of people in the room? Is that moving things at a speed which is much faster than you expected?
Well, there is a race against machines, intelligent machines and AI. There's no doubt about it. But I think there's still another 5, possibly 10 years for countries to respond by getting into the game of global value chains, including India. Get into the game. You can get in at the low skill end, at the labor intensive end, but you've got to get into the game soon. Once you're in that game, there is a ladder of opportunity. People tend to move up. One thing leads to another. Skills go up. Value added goes up. But if you don't get into the game in the next 5 to 10 years, there's a real risk that that whole opportunity of creating jobs and raising incomes through labor-intensive activity, moving on to skill-intensive activity, will be lost. And that will be a crisis for countries that are young and have a demographic bulge, a large group of people who are coming into the workforce in the next 5 to 10 years. That will be a crisis. So there has to be some urgency to get into the game of global value chains as quickly as possible. There are good examples. Vietnam has done it. To some extent, Bangladesh has done it in textiles, clothing, and footwear. And more of the emerging world has to get into that game soon, taking advantage of the fact that China is decanting a very significant amount of its labor-intensive production. Eventually, machines will be able to do this efficiently and cost-effectively. But we still have, in my opinion, as a matter of judgment, 5 to 10 years to get into that game.
It's that long, do you think?
I might be wrong. It's a matter of judgment, but I think when you look at the overall scale of technological change and the way in which production is being organized, there's still a lot of scope for human skills starting at a low level to get into global manufacturing, global services even to some extent, and move up from there.
But again, something you've talked about before, about the expectations of the next generation, the millennials. And you have an incredible sort of record here in Singapore of education and development. But obviously that does create, and I'm not just talking about Singapore, enormous expectations among the next generation that their years of study and skill acquisition are going to produce something quite extraordinary in terms of earning power. They all like to go into startups, they all want to sort of go to venture capital and so on, but there's a limit to what can be done. Do you see a disconnect and a crunch coming there at some point? Is that something that politicians are going to have to manage?
The largest disconnect is between the supply of regular university-educated kids and the demands of the market. There's an oversupply of regular, academically oriented college graduates, and the demand, which is much shorter, falls well short of that supply. You see it in the United States because about 40% of college graduates, four-year college graduates, are not working in jobs requiring a college degree. You see the same thing in the United Kingdom. You see it in places like Taiwan. You even see it in places like China, where there's an oversupply of university graduates and a shortage of people who've been trained in skills. So our task has to be to match better supply and demand in the labor market. And it means that education particularly at the tertiary level, beyond secondary school, but to some extent starting in secondary schools, has to orient a substantially greater number of people towards the skills path for advancement. Some of it is vocational, some of it is professional, but it's got to be applied in orientation. It's got to be dealing with real-world situations from relatively early in life. The whole mantra, and you see this mantra being repeated in the US elections right now, the whole mantra of college education and trying to make it as easy as possible for everyone to get a college education is a big mistake, and it will lead to more grief rather than being a solution to our problem.
Because one of the things you've pushed is lifelong learning, and the importance now of recognizing that it's not just about one burst of education and that preparing you for a much longer period of sort of stability in the workforce.
Absolutely. So our central task should be get people into the skills game early on and keep investing in them through life, because as we know, the skills needed in the marketplace will keep changing. Everyone knows that. So we need the institutions, the incentives. We need to find a way in which people, both at work or even at home, will find it easy to go through repeated bursts of learning through their lives in areas which they find enhances their prospects in the job market, but also that they find in a way that they find personally enriching.
Does anyone want to come in? We've got 10 minutes to run before you have your main course. Please, yes. Anyone else, please don't come to me afterwards and say, I tried to put up my hand and I was sitting on it. Please, over there, microphone. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I hesitated a lot to raise and ask you a question because I think that I would rather stay listening to you. It's such a demonstration of the importance of statecraft, of leadership, which are so lacking in so many parts of the world. And I entirely agree with what you said, and I hope that this thing would have more followers in the world at large. The question is the following. We live in a world, as you said, in which you have a disjunction between the old traditional idea of the states, sovereign states, confined in the territorial decisions about their own sovereign local issues, and a global economy. So there is a durable tension in the world today, especially in the last decades, between the global economy and the local politics. And when push comes to shove, decisions taken at the local, national level still have an enormous effect, and you raise very important issues about this. The question is the following. To use an expression which is going to have an increased importance, I think, judging by what's happening in some countries, which I don't want to name here, which is the following, this idea that we're living through a period of a post-truth politics in the world. An idea that truth is becoming a sort of a less important. The important thing is the way a given narrative affects the feelings and the perceptions and the beliefs of people, and this is the key thing, not what's actually happening. What I like about your approach, very Singaporean in the sense, and very an example to the world, is that, well, forget about the word truth, but there is something which are evidence, facts, lessons to be learned from the experience, and you have been drawing attention to many of them.
All right.
Do you believe in this discussion? The question is, do you believe in the discussion about the post-truth politics emerging in the world, judging by the speeches, electoral speeches of some politicians in the world at large?
Thank you. Post-truth politics, is this something you wrestle with in cabinet?
Well, very fortunately, we don't have the same predicament. But I would say, and maybe I'm being too hopeful, but I think we're going through a cycle rather than being in a permanent state of post-truth politics. I think we're going through a cycle, and I hope that cycle will turn. It'll turn when you get a degree of frustration with existing ways of politics, and you get a new crop of leaders coming up. It'll turn when there's a stronger coalescing around the middle of the political spectrum. And it'll also turn when I think the public holds politicians accountable for results. Because when you're held accountable for results, you usually can't veer too far away from the truth. And that's something which is potentially a very powerful force. When citizens, not just wealthy or middle-class citizens, but people at the lower end of the pyramid start holding local officials, local politicians, and national politicians accountable for results, whether it's sanitation or clean water or housing or air pollution. That tends to lead to a politics that's more centered on facts, something that's visible, something that's measured, and it gives less space for what you call post-truth politics.
Anyone else like to come in at this stage? We've got 5 minutes to run. Let me just keep pushing you down one track of what you said about the economy is by and large in good shape. We're seeing that in the United States at the moment.
No, I'm talking about it globally.
Yes, yeah. But again, coming down to perception and this disconnect, which we probably saw in Brexit as well, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, but we're seeing more across Europe as well. And you talked about how trade is growing, yet you have the biggest shipping line in Korea going bankrupt.
Right.
And millions of tons of shipping are out there,
Right.
uncertain of a destination. And you have a significant number
That's partly because we have an oversupply in the shipping industry.
I'm talking about the contradictions here between things looking good but things looking difficult in certain sectors. And going back to the blue-collar workers who feel globalization's left them behind, and potentially what's happening to the white-collar workers, the backroom people in offices who are going to be replaced by algorithms quite soon.
Right.
And that's why I come back to the 5 to 10 years. Could it be that the speed of change now is really going to be something which is getting back to truth, is going to be something which is going to be very difficult to manage?
So first I'll say that there is a long-standing challenge in the advanced world of stagnating wages in the middle and loss of jobs at the bottom end of the labor market, now increasingly in the middle. And the main point I was making is that it's fundamentally not due to globalization, but to domestic policy failure, cumulative failure over a long period of time. The second point I'm making is that the whole world isn't caught in the same situation. Asia and the emerging world at large, but I think especially in Asia, is still growing, and trade and investment and what we call globalization is still a positive force. That's the second point I'm making. But the third point I'll make is this, that wherever we are in the world, we have the ability to shape the future, because technology is not a force beyond our control. Terrorism is not a force beyond our control. How we prepare ourselves for a range of things that can happen in the future will determine the future. It determines whether we stay cohesive. It determines whether people get their jobs and incomes go up. So what we do determines the future. And we've got to get politics, community leaders, we've got to get the populists to understand that we can shape our future if we are honest about the problems and we help losers to get back in the game. We can shape our future.
What about the corporate leaders here as well? That's not just the politicians. Corporates have a role in this because there does appear to be increasing alienation. That's the way a lot of millennials feel about what's happening in the corporate sector, not just because of the kind of stuff which we all know about, but actually because they are rethinking their values, and therefore they might want a different composition to economic and cultural life in future.
I think that's true. The ways in which the market operates, the labor market operates, have changed. There's a lot more free agents. Some of it is not because of choice. A lot of people have no choice but to be on contract work or part-time work or temporary work. Some of it is because of choice. So we have to go with the flow to some extent, where people want to be independent, they want to determine their own future, they're self-driven individuals. But we've got to create the possibility of a thriving economy. The way in which people do business, the way in which they'd like to work, whether they like to be in an office 12 hours or 8 hours a day, or they'd like to work as free agents, will be something that society will determine. But you've got to have growth, and you've got to have a certain vibrance in your society.
Let me ask you one question here from Timur Nabili. What's your view on President Duterte's pivot to China?
So I don't consider myself expert in Philippines-China relationships. I do think in Asia that if you look past rhetoric, countries are deeply aware of the fact that we've got to live with each other, live with a balance in our own relationships. From time to time you have tiffs and quarrels, but my sense is in Asia no one wants to push things over a cliff.
Anyone like to come in? Last word. What are you going to do both here in Singapore, and how do you think governments and those in charge are going to cope with the reality of the driverless car coming up? And so many, we get back to robotics, and I'm not being facetious here, where the Uber car, taxi, which is making so much impact, no longer has a driver in it. And therefore, many of the things we're assuming require human beings are simply not going to require it anymore.
Right.
Because the machine and the technology and the AI has taken over. One final thought on that. I'm pushing you on this because I've heard you on this, envisioning it 3 or 4 years ago and 2 years ago, but I would put to you that it's actually going to move even faster. And therefore, there's going to be a real downside among those who believe they've got a career in driving a taxi.
Yeah.
Who actually find
so it is a disruptive change, and many jobs will be lost in certain industries that we take as given today. There'll be fewer truck drivers, fewer taxi drivers, many things that will be done by some combination of AI and robotics or just traditional automation. But lots of new jobs will be created. And if I talk within Asia, I see a tremendous opportunity in healthcare, in financial services, in serving consumer needs of a lower middle class that's growing at a remarkable rate. Lots of new jobs are going to be created as well. So it's the job of government and education is getting more difficult because change is happening more frequently, but it means that we shouldn't vest everything in preparing people in the first 12 or 18 years of their life for a lifetime of change. We've got to be able to invest in them throughout life so that they can cope with change, and when they get out of the labor market, they've got to get in as quickly as possible, often in a different job or in a different sector altogether. So that's the nature of the new business of government. It's about helping people to adjust to change so that they can do well even as technology starts taking over old jobs. And I think it's possible. In Singapore, we're advantaged because we are not a surplus labor economy. We don't have high levels of unemployment. So we embrace disruptive change. And our job will be to help everyone who's displaced from a job to get into a new job. It requires active government intervention. It requires working with employers, working with training agencies, and giving people the sense that you can be optimistic, even in the world of technological change.
DPM, thank you. We started, and these are your words, I didn't put them in your mouth, despondency, funk, pessimism, helplessness, and there are other deeper crises ahead. But I hope what we've done is shown that from such a concern, there are grounds for some optimism if it's managed and the scale is understood and the speed at which it might happen.
In other words, don't let the perceptions and the narrative have their own dynamic. They are overplayed, they're overstated, and the future depends on us and what we do.
Well, that should underpin our discussions tomorrow. DPM, thank you very much indeed. It's time for your next course. Jennifer.
Thanks, Nick.